All right, welcome back everyone. Last episode we got cut off a little bit. I'm in here in the library, so space is a little iffy. But no interruptions today. Nick, it's good to have you back.
Great to be back.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so let's just jump back in. So last time we had talked about cosmology and we had started to talk about cosmogony, but that's when it got cut off. So just briefly, could you summarize in a sentence or two what is cosmology within the scope of religious studies?
Do you mean cosmology or cosmogony?
Cosmology.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So cosmology is how different religions and science as well propose that the cosmos, the heavens, are arranged. So the scientific cosmology that we're settled on is that we live in the Milky Way, and the Milky Way is such and such light years away from the Andromeda galaxy and from, the Sombrero galaxy or the Sombrero Nebula and, the Crab Nebula and so on. And this cosmology is also that this whole universe was created by the Big Bang and so forth. And an example of a religious cosmology would not be like that. It would be that the heavens are layered and we are on the human or the earthly layer. And there's other layers, like where demons live, or where hungry ghosts live, or where gods live.
Hmm.
And we can sort of transmigrate through these layers. That's a Buddhist cosmology. So
Sure.
it's the answer to the question, how is the universe, or how are the heavens or the realms of this reality arranged?
Gotcha. So, structure of the universe within, a given religious tradition. Is that about right?
Yes.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, great. That'll be that's a great layout for our discussion because we're going to be talking about that with relation to another concept very shortly. So thanks for that on cosmology. Cosmogony is the next idea that we had, and we talked about it briefly, but I think we got cut off there. So what is cosmogony? Um, yeah, I'll let you take the lead.
Yeah, cosmogony is a sort of subset of cosmology, and it's the subset that deals with the beginning and the end, the origin and the terminus of the universe. So the scientific cosmogony that we've all sort of settled on is the Big Bang as the origin point of the universe as we know it.
Mm,
And a religious cosmogony would be, and then God created the heavens and the earth. Or it would be,
sure.
you know, first there were these two forces, light and dark. Or maybe it was first there was chaos, and then these two forces separated or differentiated, and they were called light and dark. These are
Mm,
cosmogonies that come from different religious traditions. And the ending point, the terminus point of cosmogony is sometimes called eschatology, and it deals with how is it all going to end? Is it going
mm,
to be a big freeze, a big heat up, a big, explosion? Is God gonna, call his chosen people up to heaven and leave everybody else? What's going to happen? And so some religions have one, but not the other. Most religions have both. Some religions have neither, right? So it's just kind of um, an interesting component. But essentially, it's, the question also of how's everything going to end?
gotcha. Yeah, thanks for that. You had eschatology was one of the other terms that I had sent you. Now, if I'm not mistaken, I think eschatology is a bit more geared towards Western religion. Am I correct in thinking that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that one is out of all these
More
terms.
theological.
Yeah, out of all these terms, which are all sort of uniquely Western and Western oriented in their construction, I think eschatology is especially so.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I'm thinking, I mean, obviously the first thing that comes to mind is the rapture
Yeah.
in Christianity. It's kind of, it's all leading up to or well, that's the end goal or the end point in Christianity. I wanted to clarify something for myself. So you had said that cosmology is both beginning and it's concerned with beginnings and ends of the universe essentially. Um, is is it actually concerned with endings? Because at least from my understanding, cosmogony is, I guess, like focused more towards like just the beginnings, but I also just like Googled it and that might have been just applicable to like cosmogony in the scientific sense.
Yeah,
So,
sure. Yeah,
mhm,
there are a lot of cases where cosmogony does not apply to the ending, to the terminus of things, but there are
mhm,
some where, time is circular. And so the beginning point is simultaneously another ending point from something previous. And so it's like, okay, these forces, light and dark, after they've differentiated and we've lived, for however many eons, then eventually they will undifferentiate and go back into a state of chaos, and then the whole cycle starts over, right? So uh,
right.
it is in those unique cases where the conception of how time flows is cyclical or circular that the beginnings also concern the ends.
Gotcha. So, maybe like Buddhism or Hinduism, where the phrase that comes to mind for me is from beginningless time. Like, in other
Hmm.
words, it seems like they're not that they don't care about it, they do, but it's just, you know, they would understand it as well. It's beginningless, so we can't, put a pin in it or where
Yeah.
it starts exactly. Um, or Hinduism, kind of the same, like cyclical nature. But so it's I guess my question then is like, is cosmogony largely concerned with time? Is that kind of like the key idea there, or is that maybe just a bit more tangential to?
I think it can be important, especially in understanding if the cosmogony you're looking at also concerns with, both the beginning and the end point. But I think that, you know, it's kind of a fun stoner thing to say that time is a construct, but it actually is. It's kind of like it's
Right.
kind of like it's a mathematical necessity, and
Mhm.
its function in our lives is only really as much as we give to it. And the reason I bring that up is because, like, given that it is a Western modern mathematical necessity, it like it doesn't have a role or a place in a lot of religious traditions that are pre-modern, and a lot of cultures that aren't Western conceive of it differently. I mean, the concept of time has obviously spread all over the earth, and everybody has clocks and watches, and they adhere to those clocks and watches, and they think of time sequentially. But for most of history, a lot of places on Earth didn't really think of it that way. They thought it was a flat circle or a sphere or a cycle, or they didn't really have a place for it in their cosmology in the sense that we conceive of it today. They
Mhm.
obviously had a concept of X happens before or after Y, but their cosmology didn't necessitate a sort of like role function or position for the concept of time as we know it right now, right? So like we have it because we have to figure out how far away are we from the Big Bang and how far away are we from whatever ending there is, right?
Right.
But like it's kind of it's all kind of relative and kind of different when you get into different religious traditions and different ancient texts and cultures and stuff. So time is a funny thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess it kind of goes back to that idea that, these are all like, we're saying that it's like these are Western, you know, ideas and concepts. And in a way, like I almost feel like it's trite, but it's true. We're, born in this Anglo-American culture and we're using ideas that are largely European or American. And so it gets hard to like impose those on religions that don't fit into that culture historically. So, thank you for that perspective um, as well. Okay, so I want to ask now, what is the relationship between cosmology and cosmogony? And I think you kind of touched on this already, but what would be your answer there for the relationship?
I think that cosmogony is sort of a subset of cosmology. So you take a religious tradition And that religious tradition has a cosmology. And within that cosmology, you can find a cosmogony, which discusses the origin and perhaps also the ending of the universe. So,
Mm,
um, because this is all sort of, you know, Western academic concepts being imposed on things that might not fully line up with it very well, you know, there's going to be some there's going to be some corners hanging out whenever you take something from a religion and say this is that religion's cosmology. And
mhm,
in the exact same fashion, there's going to be some corners that hang out when you say this is that religion's cosmogony. For example, you know, China China is so incredibly diverse linguistically and culturally and ethnically and has been for thousands of years. And so if you look for a cosmogony in Taoism or in Chinese folk religions, there's like a lot of them, you know. There's like way more than just one. And
right.
they all have very complicated relationships to each other that we haven't really fully come to understand in the scholarship because we don't have either linguistic access to that sort of stuff or because like there wasn't any sort of written record or written history that described that relationship to us. So we'll see like several similar cosmogonies across, you know, different a whole swath of regions, but they'll all have minor variations. And additionally, you know, this area here will have a different cosmogony than that area over there because there's so many historically, so many loci or foci of power that have been there. You know, it hasn't just been one big centralized state. And so it's had
Right.
lots of mythologies, lots of languages, lots of cosmologies and cosmogonies. And so like I said, there's some corners that hang out of the box, but generally that's what I would say is the relationship between the two.
Okay, great. Awesome. I think that lines up kind of with the scientific view as well. I mean, and I say this as a non-scientist, obviously, but I'm thinking, okay, if I want to understand the universe and the structure of the universe, at some point I'm going to have to ask, well, where did the universe come from? Where is it going? What's happening to it? Um, in this as time progresses, where is it going? So, yeah, I guess that's just how I'm conceptualizing it. So thank you for that. Cosmogony and cosmology out of the way, but we'll come back to cosmology in just a second here. Um, my next question to you is, what is soteriology?
This is a fun one. I like soteriology a lot. Soteriology is sort of it's a religious studies term that's real a fancy term that refers to the sort of end goal, the end point of practice, the end point of study, the end point of whatever. The soteriology of graduate school is a PhD and a job in academia, right?
Okay,
The soteriology of, you know, taking a shower is being clean, right? And
sure.
so um, it's like both the ending point, but it's like a desired ending point, right? It's what all of the prescriptions for practice and study culminate into. And
Mm,
so the soteriology for Buddhism, and you know, I would get in trouble for saying this because there's so many different soteriologies in Buddhism, but the soteriology in Buddhism is enlightenment or Buddhahood or being born in a pure land, right?
mm,
And so it's sort of what everything's pointing at. The Christianity soteriology is being reborn in heaven and living there forever, you know.
right,
And so it's an ending point for the individual. It's not a universal ending point. It's sort of what everyone who adheres to that religion is after. And unlike all the other terms that we've been discussing, I can't say this is the scientific soteriology because there isn't one. You know, there just simply isn't one. Like there's no, if you spend your life devoted to principles and practices of scientific method and scientific research and investigation, and then you know, you adhere to that and live that for however long, nothing really happens to you according to those principles themselves. It's not
right,
like, oh, now you're a scientific bodhisattva or something like that. Now you're a saint of science. Like you can get famous and you can get well acclaimed for stuff that you figure out, but the soteriology is not universally applicable. There's good scientists and bad scientists, and they're all scientists.
Hmm.
So this is a unique case with this term in particular. It's strictly a religious studies and philosophy thing.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. So as you were giving that, I was almost waiting for you to say the salvation of the soul. And I'm
Yes, that's one.
curious. Yeah, yeah. You gave a much broader context. So I'm curious now, is it because I guess again, kind of as we're saying, it's kind of hard to impose this idea of a soul that's saved onto other religions, cultures, etc.
Yeah, yeah. The soul is well, as I've said before, I'm convinced by the argument of no self or non-self. And I think that the soul is sort of a contrivance. That's kind of my personal opinion is that it's something that's made up with a specific goal in mind, a specific agenda in mind, a specific
Hmm.
desire in mind that the existence of a soul fulfills. But yeah, there are a lot of people historically, globally, that have thought of this thing called soul that we now call soul,
Hmm.
but there are also plenty that have not thought about that and have decided that it's sort of made up and it's contrived. And so I think that um, because the jury is out in the sense that, the vote is like 9-3, you know, there is a
Hmm.
soul versus there is no soul. I think that for that reason, you can't really say much about the soul itself unless you sort of take one of those sides. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, and that makes sense. And I guess I'm thinking now of like indigenous cultures, like there isn't, the I mean, even in Buddhism, obviously there's many hells and many heavens that you can possibly go into after you die. But I'm thinking of, I guess, indigenous religions where um one recurring theme, so far as I know, is this idea of like living underground. And it's not like, to point to cosmology, I guess their cosmology is, well, no, like you literally live under the ground in the water when you die. Um, but that has nothing to do with, your soul being saved and cleansed. And I guess now that I'm saying it out loud, it very much sounds like a Euro-Christian idea. Um, and and that's fine. But just being aware of that. Um, yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. The soul takes many different shapes, even within Christian tradition and Christian lore and Christian soteriology and around the whole world. You know, even though soteriology is sort of Christian centric and does, sort of prioritize baked into its term and its history, this idea of the salvation of a soul, you can still kind of use the term in a more broad sense to at least get something useful out of studying other religions as well. I think that something that's important to remember for all these terms that we're going to be discussing throughout this series is that they are all different tools that we can use to, it's like an archaeologist has a bunch of tools, right? They have brushes, they have picks, they have shovels, and you don't use a shovel whenever the bones are in front of you. You use a brush. And, you
Right.
don't use a brush whenever you're just starting to dig, you use a shovel. And,
Hmm.
it's always about using the right tool correctly and knowing when that tool has limitations that you can't use it for anymore and picking up a new one. And so, they all have their limitations. And I think that um, understanding those limitations is very important. And you eventually get to a point where you're not even thinking about these terms prescriptively, you're thinking of them descriptively, and you're thinking of them as things that can be tossed away on a whim whenever what you're looking at doesn't line up with them.
Gotcha. Yeah, I like that idea of these concepts as being descriptively provisional, I
Yes.
guess. And that, it's like, well, they're useful up to a point, but at a certain point we need to say, okay, well, let's see what, this culture slash religion itself has to say on the matter. And that's cool because I'm sure that there's many, I mean, you mentioned China, China's not, in the middle of nowhere. It's the most populous country in the world. I think it is maybe right behind India, but um I mean, you get what I'm saying. It's
Yeah,
not a remote, indigenous culture, and yet, as you're saying, there's still so much that we can't necessarily articulate in the academic research. Well, that's that's a really cool place where new research can flourish. So, yeah. So, thank you for again bringing that perspective in. This is why it's so much better than just Googling it and just reciting the definitions. Uh,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so next question. So we talked about soteriology, cosmology, and cosmogony. What is the relationship between cosmology and soteriology? And if you want, to pick apart cosmogony in there, however you want as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So the soteriology of something, of a religion, for example, cannot but occur in the cosmology, because the cosmology is the conception of the whole of reality, and we're in
Mhm.
it. And whatever happens to us individually happens within that cosmology and within the context and within the forces of that cosmology. So in Buddhism, whenever you achieve the soteriology, so to speak, if you could even say there is one, of Buddhism, you have navigated a specific cosmology and you are continuing to navigate a specific cosmology to do so.
Mhm.
So in science, the cosmology is we live on this planet that is 93 million miles away from our star, and that star is so many light years away from the next one. And all of this is a galaxy, and there's the chance that there's life out there, but basically, an important principle of science is that what we see here in front of our senses and with our fancy, expensive tools is what there is, and what we
Mhm.
can't see simply isn't, right? If it shows up via observation or via experimentation, then it is there. And if it doesn't, then it's not. Or I
Mhm.
guess I should say you can't demonstrate that it could be there, right? Because there you have to demonstrate. Science is like the show me state. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Well, at least to take a scientific perspective, that's probably what their cosmology. I
Yeah,
think
and
it's
in a
good.
scientific perspective, yeah.
Yeah. Not that it's that I agree with that, just,
Yeah, exactly. It's good to qualify that.
yeah.
But then in Buddhism, to become a fully realized Buddha, you have to preach to human beings, but also you have to preach to bodhisattvas and gods and hungry ghosts and demons.
Mm,
And you have to, or you don't have to, but you get the ability to travel to different heavens and replicate yourself to appear in those heavens. And for example, the Buddha of the future, Maitreya, is said to currently reside in the Triastrimsa heaven, or I'm sorry, not that one, the Tushita heaven. He's
mhm.
said to reside there while he's doing his bodhisattva work and getting ready to be a Buddha for the future. If I became a Buddha today, I could go visit him. Where is he? In science, we would say, what planet is he on, right? Um, he's not on a different planet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He's
So the Naruto shadow clone thing is true. You can clone yourself and have them do your work for you. Okay. All right.
exactly right, right. So I've achieved this soteriology in Buddhism, hypothetically, and I can go to these places in this cosmology. And I've had to sort of do so in the context and subject to the forces of this cosmology, right? Another aspect of the Buddhist cosmology is that this is samsara, and samsara is defined against nirvana.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of controversial whether it's defined against nirvana and if they're complete opposites. And it's controversial if samsara and nirvana are both part of the cosmology, or if
Mm-hmm.
samsara is the cosmology and nirvana is the soteriology. But my point stands that like these sort of go hand in hand. If I
Yeah.
achieve nirvana, then I have done so subject to the state of samsara, and then
Mm,
also, getting to the state of nirvana, getting to
right.
that plane of non-existence, so to speak. And so it's all, you know, it's the relationship in the religious practice, in the religious study between the individual and the cosmology to
Mm-hmm.
achieve the soteriology.
Gotcha. Yeah. So the first image that popped into my mind was someone's drowning, and let's take the Western Christian, interpretation of soteriology for just a second here. And I guess I'm just thinking, if you are to stop drowning, if you're to be saved from drowning, someone pulls you out, whatever, that saving, yourself from drowning has to occur within the context of there's water, there's
Mhm.
a lake or an ocean or something, and then you getting pulled out of that, you know, is the soteriology part.
Yeah,
That kind of about right?
absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, so I had another question that I wanted to ask you then. So within this you know, to use the words that we've been talking about so far, you talked about Buddhism a little bit. Would it be like, could you make an argument, I guess, in the terminology we've been using, that enlightenment in the Buddhist sense is an abandoning of cosmology, or it's breaking free from cosmology? What do you think?
I think that in Mahayana Buddhism, it is. Um,
Okay.
I think that in later Mahayana, historically later Mahayana Buddhism, it is because of the importance and the prioritization and the emphasization of emptiness in late Mahayana Buddhism. In
Mm,
early Mahayana Buddhism and in like earlier Buddhism, which we might now sort of diagnose as Theravada Buddhism, I don't think that it's a complete abandonment of cosmology.
mm,
Um, so because of the emphasis of emptiness in later Mahayana, um, we even get the Heart Sutra, which says there are no six realms. There is no suffering, no end to suffering, no path to the end of suffering, and no eightfold path. You know what I mean? And there's no desire, there's no living, old age, and death. There's no ending of old age and death. There's no, and the whole point of the Heart Sutra saying all this is that um, don't get caught up. You know, people
mm,
can get caught up in the cosmology, and in getting caught up in the cosmology, you miss the point, right? I guess like you could say that imagine like the Buddhist cosmology as a circle, and like the Buddhist soteriology is a line that originates somewhere inside the circle, but then ends just outside of it. You know what I mean?
mhm.
The
Okay.
soteriology of late Mahayana Buddhism goes right outside of it. And basically, the Heart Sutra is saying, don't get caught up in the circle because you're just
Mm,
going to go in circles. The circle isn't
yeah,
actually there in some way that actually exists, right?
yeah.
It's it's provisionally there, so to speak. You know what I mean? And it doesn't exist because nothing exists in a substantial, non, you know, unchanging sort of fashion, right? And so the reason I say that I think that earlier Buddhism and early Mahayana Buddhism are still cosmological in their soteriology um, is because enlightenment is not exiting the cosmology.
Mm,
Becoming a Buddha is, and possibly even becoming a bodhisattva is, but enlightenment by itself, which is what is the practice of earlier Buddhism and Theravada nowadays, it's kind of still firmly here
mm,
because you can still be reincarnated after enlightenment in some traditions, not all, but some, um, or otherwise, enlightenment happens to you here, and then you achieve nirvana, and so you're like you're kind of in the cosmology, but you're not. You know what I mean? I think
yeah,
nirvana could be inside the cosmology, but it also could be outside, depending on who you ask.
right.
Um, all that to say, it's kind of a complicated thing. I think there's many conceptions of
Yeah,
this in Buddhism in history and even now.
right, for sure. But they are, inexorably related. And I see what you mean. I'm glad that you defined it like more generally as you did at the beginning, because as I am thinking about it, what you were just talking about with enlightenment, from my understanding, it if you were to separate enlightenment from the cosmology, I mean that's kind of the whole point of like the bodhisattva path, in a sense, that like um enlightenment is to be found here specifically as an ethical principle of becoming a bodhisattva. You don't become a bodhisattva just because you're so enlightened. You become a bodhisattva because you have attained, whatever, I mean, Buddha level enlightenment, I guess, and you remain here to teach other people. And then that is considered enlightenment, as being, you know, firmly planted within the cosmology, and then, trying to teach what you know to others.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and in early Buddhism, there's the six realms doctrine, where there's only demons, hungry ghosts, animals, people, and two types of gods. Um, in later Mahayana, there's 10 realms,
Hmm.
right? But all the way through, there's still bodhisattvas and Buddhas. So
Hmm.
in the six realms cosmology, Buddhas and bodhisattvas and Pratyeka Buddhas and arhats, they are absolutely outside the cosmology. There's no realm of transmigration for them. But in later Mahayana, they're brought back in because of the importance of the bodhisattva path and because of the importance of, emptiness and because of the importance of, like you say, doing it here rather than leaving.
Hmm. Gotcha. Okay, awesome. That's really cool. See, this is why I do this, to expand my Eurocentric consciousness to other religions as well. Um, cool. Okay, so let's move on now to well, we talked about this already a little bit. Um, Eschatology. I guess, did you have anything? Could you give another summary, just because the one after this will differentiate a little bit?
Yeah, I think that in a general sense, right, we could say that it is a discussion of the ending point of the universe, of reality, of everything.
Hmm.
Um, but this one also is very highly, highly centered upon Abrahamic religions. And
Hmm.
so in my mind, maybe not in the actual definition, but in my mind, it invokes apocalypse. It invokes, like, there's some religions where the ending, like I said, is a beginning point for something else. And it could be very chaotic and there could be fire and there could be, destruction, but it's not like an actual cut off end of all time. But to me, in
Right.
my mind, eschatology is like, we've been around here for 13.4 billion years. And whenever the eschatology arrives, it's going to stop ticking. It's going to stop counting. That will be the last year, the last month, the
Yeah.
last day. And so, and this is specifically pointing to like Christian eschatology. Like something's going to happen and then there's not going to be a universe anymore.
Right. And from my understanding, the root eschaton literally means the last thing, as in the last thing ever.
Yeah.
And so eschatology is, all that approaches that last thing, in the case of Christianity, the rapture. I don't know too much about Judaism or Islam, but maybe they're kind of similar. And that's, within their cosmology, the end of time
Yeah.
itself. So, so that's eschatology. What is teleology?
This is interesting. So I danced in my head with speaking about teleology during the soteriology discussion, and I decided against it. Um, Teleology is also a study of endings. It's a philosophical term that applies to, you know, we talk about means and we talk about ends. What are the ends?
Hmm.
But it's different from eschatology because it's not ever the last thing. It's not ever a hard cut. So it's based on the Greek telos, and you could even say that like the telos of Christianity is soteriology, the salvation of the soul. Does that make
Hmm.
sense? The end goal for the individual, or the end goal of this idea, the end point of this idea taken to its logical conclusion is the teleology, the telos.
Mhm.
Um, it's not apocalyptic, it's conceptual. So it's like, um,
Okay.
okay, imagine this. It's 2015 and you're sitting there and it's like, yeah, I'm at Thanksgiving and that weird uncle has showed up and he has started saying things about immigrants. and he started saying things about abortion.
Mm.
So I'm
That
sitting, yeah, exactly. And then it's Thanksgiving 2016, and he's really excited.
hmm
It's November 24th, Thanksgiving of 2016, 20 days after something very important has happened, and
Sure.
he's real excited. And so the telos of these ideas that he started talking about in 2015, abortion, immigration, whatever, the telos is a Trump presidency or voting for Trump or
Mm.
being a Republican, right? The telos is sort of the end result of these ideas that just started here and then he ended up getting into. You know what I mean? And so it's it's it functions heavily on sort of time in real life, but it is also conceptual. Like,
Wouldn't it be like the other way around? Like be like vote Republican to get to. I mean, it's an arbitrary example, but I guess I'm thinking like the end goal is to get some sort of policy passed in your favor, and so you vote that way because that's the thing that you want. But maybe I'm not conceptualizing it right. I
it kind of that I mean, you're kind of using it correctly because it really is just sort of your directional tool, your
mm,
arrow in, your tip of the arrow in whatever you're thinking about, right? So whenever we say that's a slippery slope, whenever someone says something or starts thinking a certain way and we say that's a slippery slope, it leads to something dangerous, something bad. Whatever it leads to, that's the telos.
okay. Ah, I see. So what this is all for, in a sense, or what this is all aspiring towards or
Yeah.
leading up to.
Yeah. So whenever the uncle started saying stuff about just vague stuff about like immigrants, the telos
Ah,
was the resulting Muslim ban that happened in 2017.
mm.
You know what I mean?
Right, right. Yeah, that makes sense. And just to clarify, so this is not exclusively a religious concept, teleology. It's broader, more broadly philosophical as well.
That's right.
Gotcha. Awesome. Um, okay, cool. I I'd like so having touched on eschatology and also teleology, I'd like to ask what the relationship oh, excuse me. Um, what is the relationship between soteriology and eschatology? Let's start with that one.
Yeah. So in as much as there is a relationship between cosmology and eschatology,
hmm
because eschatology is the end of the cosmos,
hmm
in as much as there's that relationship, there's a relationship between soteriology and eschatology.
hmm
I'm not really super steeped and super up to date in Christian theology, but
hmm
my understanding is that everybody who has died in all of human history and will die for the rest of human history up to the rapture, they they have gone where they're going, and when the rapture happens, nothing changes about them at all.
mm
If you have died and gone to heaven and then it's rapture time, you just see a bunch of people show up at the door. You don't go anywhere, right?
Okay.
Um, and so like,
Soteriology remains consistent.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, those people have already, if they've gone to heaven, they have already achieved soteriology. And whenever eschatology strikes, it's really only going to strike people on earth. Um,
hmm
Whenever you start looking at other religions for whom these terms were not crafted and for whom these terms do not really do much for you, you start to see like, okay, well, if somebody has already achieved nirvana, does the soteriology, or I'm sorry, does the eschatology of Buddhism still apply? And what I've kind of been avoiding talking about so far is that there is no eschatology in Buddhism. There
mm
simply isn't. There is beginningless and endless time. There is no cosmogony that's native to Buddhism, and there's no eschatology. There is a soteriology, the doctrine of enlightenment and how you get there, but there is no eschatology whatsoever. And so you're starting to see like you can have cosmology and soteriology without eschatology.
hmm
And that so their relationship is basically sometimes they touch, sometimes they're related, but other times they're not, you know.
hmm Sure. Yeah. Man, as this like as we're just talking more, like it's really just impressed upon me how much our, Western conception of religion is very limited. And I'm
Yeah.
not saying, I'm fairly progressive politically, if you couldn't tell already. But I'm not just saying it to be progressive or whatever. It's just literally like, wow, this, I mean, eschatology specifically that we're talking about does not apply as a religious concept to Buddhism at all because,
Yeah.
beginningless time, beginningless end. It just doesn't work. So, and I don't lament that at all. I think that's, really cool because that means that there's a lot of really cool research to be done, and a lot of ideas to be had. Um, but so thank you for that. Okay, what is the main distinction between eschatology and teleology?
I think that it's simply that eschatology is the last end. It is the cutting off of everything. After
Hmm.
eschatology, there is nothing else. But after teleology, there is. Because, like I said, eschatology is sort of what happens to all of the universe, all of reality. And and there is, and teleology is like what happens at the end of taking this line of thinking to its conclusion. What is the end of taking this argument to its conclusion? What is the end of taking this sort of religious or philosophical concept to its logical conclusion whenever it's been applied in real life?
Yeah. Could it apply to practices as well?
Yeah, yeah. So the teleology sort of the practice of um, let's say prayer, the teleology of that it would be to achieve unity with God,
Mm,
right? And so that's not an eschatology because it's not the end of the universe, but it is sort of
okay.
the ending point of it's everything that prayer is pointed to as a
Mm,
practice.
okay. Okay, gotcha. Awesome. Thanks for those distinctions. Yeah, that actually brings us to the end of all the questions that I had. And thank you for clearing up all of those for me. Like I seriously feel more like I can use these terms not just more appropriately, but with more context as well. So if I say, this is eschatological, maybe it's not, but at least I know like in the ways that it's not anymore. Um, but cool. I did have a few more questions if you're up for that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so as I was thinking, and like so we're in religious studies mode, and now we can kind of zoom out to our cosmopolitan mindset, thinking about everything. So as we are talking about eschatology and the differences between that and teleology, I guess I'm just thinking like it seems like science very much has this Abrahamic conception of the universe in the sense that, it says that there is a beginning, there is an end. Now, whether or not that's actually the case, it could be, but I guess I'm just saying like it's almost like science as a as a intellectual tradition started from the same assumption that Christianity has, which is there was a beginning and then there's going to be an end, even though we can kind of argue about, whatever that might be. I would argue that we can't say with certainty, you know, that that's true, and that's not because I hate science or I think science is bullshit or whatever, but the the Big Bang Theory is a theory, and that means that it is true only until it's disproven or until there's a better one. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, let's I'm going to start historically and then I'm going to come back to something very, very modern.
Sure.
Historically, the scientific method and science as an intellectual tradition originates in the Enlightenment era of European history, where the people who were doing it and coming up with it were a bunch of Christians, or they were responding to Christianity and posing something that sort of was an alternative way of looking at the world, but they had grown up and lived in nothing but a Christian world. And
Mm,
so, you know, there I think that there is tons of scholarship out there about how Christianity is so baked in culturally to so many academic pursuits and just academic pursuit in general in the Anglophone world or in the European world, because it's just central. It's central. And
Hmm.
one of the things that's interesting is that scientism and in some ways science itself in reality. So the radical ideology of scientism, but also actual science, they
Hmm.
both purport to be able to transcend culture and religion and uh, bias, so to speak, because it purports to rely on things that are tangible and things that are they're broadly falsifiable. So it's
Mm.
like if I do this experiment where I pour, vinegar and baking soda into a container in America, it's going to foam up and expand just the same way if I do it in China, right? It works no matter who does it or where you are or what anything like that. It
Mm.
purports to be that way, but that's an ideal that's not realized. It's just
Mm.
simply not realized.
How so?
There's a huge repeatability and a huge falsifiability crisis going on in all fields of science right now
Hmm.
because we're looking back to foundational experiments that were done in all the hard sciences and all in the soft sciences as well.
Mm.
And we're these foundational ones that are central to how we view the world. And we're finding we can't replicate the same results again by doing these experiments again. We can't replicate the same results and we can't repeat the experiment. The conditions cannot be matched. And this is looking back in time, but this is also, of course, looking across borders and across cultures. You know, for example, there's like a very strong relationship in the life sciences between universities in America and universities in Japan.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of biomedical research that goes on that's partnered between these two places. And the results that come from both universities, both institutions, the ones in Japan and the ones here, sometimes there's like it's really hard to put them together. It's really hard to mix them and synthesize them. You would think, okay, I'm testing a cancer drug on, brain tumors. Why should it not work the same way in Japanese hospitals that it does in American hospitals, other than the obvious things, right? Different diet, different lifestyle. Why
Mhm.
doesn't it work chemically? Why don't we have the same portion of, you know, people who go into remission versus those who don't, just because it's between these two different groups? How does that
Yeah,
make sense? There's a variable that's not understood there. You
right. And
can't,
I'm
yeah.
guessing it can't be like just attributed to like uh difference in like physiology.
Some
Like,
of it is like a difference in, like lifestyle and diet and genetics, of course, and so on and
yeah,
so forth. But
that's what,
but a lot of it, it seems like the difference is bigger than that. And so
right.
there, we're seeing this huge issue with that, and it threatens the very core of all that we know in science. Um, to use like a very casual, very sort of jokey example, there's been a meme going around for the last few years talking about girl math, right? So, to
I
quote
don't know that one.
to
Go
quote
ahead.
girl math, it's like you look at your bank statement, you don't have to count the Starbucks. That's girl math. You know what I mean?
All
You
right.
you don't have to count, going to Starbucks because that's your bank account functions on boy math and Starbucks doesn't
Okay.
count. That's girl math. It's a
Okay. I
joke,
gotta
but
start doing no math.
it speaks to something very, very important. Math is cultural. Math
Mm.
absolutely is cultural in this exact way that we're talking about, right? It has these fundamental assumptions that are specific to a European and Christian way of looking at the world or an American way of looking at the world. You know, girl math is like funny and stuff. It's like a joke, but
Yeah. Yeah.
how does math work out if you don't take time as a constant? How does math work out if you don't take any anything that we think of as constant and as invariable in math as constant and invariable? It's things are so different, whenever
Yeah.
you look at different cultures historically. For example, I mean, base 10 counting, that's not something that everyone in the world has always done. They've done base
Yeah.
12 or even base 27, you know?
Yeah. And Maya used base 20, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's
And their
like,
system's a lot more refined because they only use three like characters basically,
yeah,
or glyphs even, and they're able to calculate, millions of years into the future and millions of years into the past to create their, incredibly unique calendars that they're famous for.
the Mayan calendars, right. And so, it just goes to show that even counting is cultural.
Yeah. Yeah. So tying that back in then to our discussion of science, I guess what I'm thinking is, the European Enlightenment obviously draws very heavily upon, and what I said about Christianity, it draws very heavily upon, Greek philosophy, obviously. Um, but that only is, Greek philosophy only survives through scholasticism, and
Mhm.
you can't get the European Enlightenment without traveling all throughout medieval Christianity, and so I guess it makes sense that um, well, I don't know, where where would you like to take that?
Yeah, no, I see exactly what you mean. I mean, we're seeing what you're laying out here is essentially the European genealogy and only European genealogy of
What's
science.
genealogy?
What's that?
What's genealogy?
Like the genealogy, like the heritage of science. It's in modern science, its parents are the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment's parents are scholasticism, and
Mm.
scholasticism's parents are, you know, you could say Greek philosophy or medieval
Oh,
Christianity.
okay. Lineage. I don't know
Yeah.
why that word sounded so foreign to me for a second, but
No, it's totally fine.
that genealogy. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
cool. Um, but yeah, so I guess do you kind of see um that superimposition of like a Christian cosmology and maybe to an extent values even in science, and if not directly as a reaction to it and therefore bound to it through its kind of reactionary measures. Do you see that at all, or?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. One of my favorite, most recent sort of trends in Christian and Western religious scholarship that I've seen, what little I have seen, is this trend of examining secular ethics as being recapitulations and repackagings of Protestant ethics. So secular
Interesting. Also,
Buddhists, like secular Buddhists or secular Christians or something like that, this idea of secularity is very modern, where you basically are emptying the world out of not, you're not raising out all churches and you're not, burning down all religious institutions, but this idea of secularity as like a society or a way of life or an aspect of society or an aspect of life that is completely free of all religious influence or consciousness. Um, so people try to take a secular approach to their spirituality or to their religion, which is interesting to say the least, but it's this idea of like, let's take all the religious stuff off of the religion I'm looking at and get right down to the ethic.
mhm.
How are you supposed to live? Right. And
Yeah.
that is in these religions. I personally think that, all religious ethics are pointed at a soteriology, which is something that occurs in a cosmology, which
Mhm.
is, all under the umbrella of the religion you're looking at. You're kind of picking and
Yeah.
choosing. But anyways, to take us to be a secular Christian is to take all of the heaven and hell and God and Jesus stuff out of it and say Christianity is all about, well, the golden rule, you know, don't kill, don't steal, don't cheat, all this
Mhm.
other stuff. It's not the one about, no false idols. It's not that one. It's don't kill, kill, steal, cheat, whatever. So
Yeah.
people will be secular Buddhists and they will say that, well, basically the Buddha preached the golden rule. And I'm
Mhm.
like, okay, like, no, he didn't. um,
You
being a
should write
secular,
"Why I Am Not a Christian," Nick. You should
I
be
should, yeah.
a follow-up to Thompson's book.
So it's like this, it's this concept of like what all you have done by deeming yourself secular and being so emphatic on the golden rule or on just being a nice guy or something, you're just repackaging the Protestant values of the golden rule because it sends you to heaven, or being a nice guy because it sends you to heaven. You know what I mean?
Right.
You're repackaging that and reliving and redoing that. And so a secular ethic is still a Protestant ethic.
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that. Man, you know, I had some questions that, and we could dig into this like mo deeper in another episode, but just since we've been talking about all this stuff, I'm curious to know, like zooming out, like really broad picture, even just in your own terms, like however you think about it. Do you think that thinking about the world in religious ways or with religious concepts, even if we don't know what those concepts are, do you feel like it's kind of escapable for even, the most militant, hardcore atheists or someone who just doesn't care at all about religion?
Absolutely not.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. And why is that?
Secularity, this thing you're talking about is secularity, right? This
Hmm.
sort of post-religious world, this
Wait,
world,
absolutely not. You think you can't, or you absolutely not. You think you can?
absolutely not. You cannot reach this ideal of secularity. You can't reach a non-religious worldview.
Okay. Okay. Got
Um, so the reason why is that this idea of secularity is completely unreachable. It's completely impossible because we live in a world where religion has happened
it.
and everyone knows that it happened. So like
Yeah.
just even knowing that it happened means that anything that you try to do after it, in response to it, opposite to it, is going to be influenced and relative to it also. It's going to be bound to it. It's going to be determined by it. Even religious institutions, religious doctrine, religious ways of thinking, even they themselves textually have room in their worlds for what we call secularity. And so
Mhm.
in that, that sort of reads to me like, oh, they're clearing out a space for secularity and determining it and exerting power over it.
Mhm.
Religious institutions, religious doctrines, religious texts have control over where they choose not to interfere, not to be, right?
Mhm.
You see this, for example, in, there's different religious texts and different religious doctrines that are not Christian that sort of speak to like well, this is an affair for the gods, the spirits, for the shamans, whatever. This is not. This is an affair for the accountants, right?
Mhm.
So they're kind of marking off the boundaries. They're saying this is where our influence should end.
Yeah.
And like so they're exerting their own power over secularity. So secularity isn't secular.
Yeah.
It doesn't exist. You can't we have we are subject to the forces of religion and have been for as long as human civilization has existed. And it's impossible to not be subjected to them because the world we live in is, it's like saying, can you be a fish and live your whole life in an ocean, but not ever get wet? You know,
Yeah.
it's like
I
you
guess
are wet, you're a fish, you know?
yeah, I guess in a way it's like and I'm sure there's a very, you know, there's a lot of secular philosophies out there, but I guess in a way like you could say secularism is saying like, well, like secularism is being human with like and then this religion stuff is just like extra to it. And it's kind of just like added on and it's added on for social cohesion or for, in group whatever. But um I feel like that's just evolutionarily untrue.
Right.
And when you look to indigenous societies, like I'm pretty sure they're all practicing some form of religion. I don't think there is, such a thing as a, indigenous culture that doesn't have religion. And if there is, great, that'll be cool. I'll have my mind blown, but um like it just seems so central to what it means to be human. Um
Mhm.
And yeah, so then I guess my next question would be, um, what do you see that relationship as, like evolutionarily? Because, I believe in the theory of evolution. I think that there's a lot to be questioned about how Darwin conceptualizes it for many of the reasons that you have pointed out um, now. But yeah, what do you like? I mean, obviously, we evolved from ancient ancestors who, you know, were distantly related to chimpanzees and apes from. Um, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's a lot of different theories out there
Hmm.
about this. So some theories of religion speak to the fact that it is an artifact of evolution, that it evolved into us. Maybe you could say it's a scientistic view of the emergence or the origin of religion in human societies. They say, there was a certain point in, like evolutionary time, hundreds of millions of years ago,
Mm,
where, you know, organisms got to this point where they were no longer sort of only conceptualizing of what was in front of them and began to start to dream up, speculate, make up, feel, experience, whatever word you want to say,
hmm.
something beyond, right?
Right.
Um, and there is some credence to that. A pattern seeking brain will impose patterns on something that has no pattern and cannot be sort of conceptualized in terms of a pattern. And when it does so, it's that's kind of an origin point for thinking, you know, hey, whenever, it rains, that's there's something sentient behind that. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Because you have this conceptualization of like, well, I come and go of my own accord, and so why shouldn't the rain come and go of its own accord?
Sure.
Right? The human brain likes to look at random chance and impose pattern on it and
Sure.
sort of decide that that pattern has meaning, that that pattern is significant or that it is actually real and can be sort of subsumed under that which I know instead of that which I just simply don't know.
Right.
So there's some credence to that. Um, However, that theory also sort of implies that there is an evolutionary function, a species level function of religion, like you're saying, social cohesion and social order and community and, you know, rules that we all live by. I would believe that if there was one religion,
Mm,
one single one,
mm.
if we all had it and it imposed order and community on all of us, you know, um,
Yeah. Because if it's simply a feature of evolution, then sure, I mean, it would look the same everywhere. Like, we all have hands, and
yeah,
that's
yeah.
we all have hands no matter where you are in the world because they're useful to us, or opposable thumbs, that might be a better one.
But like, I'm not saying that it's like I'm not saying I fully doubt that it's a feature of evolution, but I
Yeah.
kind of doubt that it serves an evolutionary purpose. I think that
Mm,
a Darwinian view of evolution looks at everything,
mm,
even stuff it shouldn't look at, and it says, I can apply this natural selection, survival of the fittest, what is your fitness sort of point of view on it, right? So that's where we get social Darwinism from, is this idea like, okay, well, some people, they are less
don't
fit.
believe in eugenics, Nick? Come on, that's the latest scientific evidence, dude.
I'm going to take the brave stance on this show and say I don't. I'm not in favor of
Okay,
eugenics.
you passed. You can come back. You passed.
Yeah, but like it's very easy and common for like scientific people to look at
Right.
religion and say, well, what's its function biologically?
Hmm.
Because it happened does not immediately imply that it has a function towards the survival or the continuation of the species.
I see. And maybe again with the Christian influence thing, it's almost like saying like, I feel like that invokes a certain intelligence in nature, and I'm not saying that I don't believe in that. I actually very much do, but it's kind of like, you know, it's making the argument of intelligent design almost in the sense that it has to serve with I guess, let's just call upon Dawkins here, the selfish gene as God basically, and saying like, well, if it exists, it has to be, in service of this. But, you could, and many militant atheist people do that, it's like, well, the vagus nerve like goes like this, and then it like goes like all this like right here, and then it goes down. That's not a very intelligent or smart design, and yet it happened just by chance. But it doesn't serve an evolutionary function. It's actually the exact opposite. It's very physiologically disadvantageous to have it that way, and you can get a lot of like and I've suffered from this like really bad like hiccups because like of the location of the vagus nerve, and it gets pinched, and that's not fun, and it's definitely not evolutionarily advantageous. So um but yeah. uh
But it doesn't shorten your lifespan. And so that's kind of why it has continued to be a part of the species, is because it's like you can think of evolution as like the cheapest architect or the cheapest engineer that money could buy. It's not going to make something where every single bit, every single thing is like perfect and functional. It's going to make the minimum amount just to get you to reproductive age. And once you're past that, it doesn't matter. It doesn't care. It's not important, right? So
yeah.
like I've often thought about this with human teeth. Human teeth invariably start to rot out by the time somebody's like 60 or 70, and they often live to be at least 70 or 80 or even 90 or 100, and their teeth have started to rot out. And people don't realize when your teeth are decaying and you get like an infection or something, it can spread to your brain, into your heart, and kill you, right?
Mm,
And so the weakness comparatively of teeth compared to any other part of the body, and the fact that they decay at such an advanced rate, is evidence that like teeth are not perfect evolutionary design. They are just the minimum amount to get you to reproductive age. They are the
mm,
minimum amount that's necessary to get you to pass on your genetic material. And after that, you're stuck with whatever you started with, you know.
yeah, or
And
whatever you have left.
yeah, you're subject to, okay, you've done your thing. Now you get to sit and rot for the rest of your life. And
Yeah.
and in that regard, you can't think of it as being intelligent or as being kind at all.
Yeah. Yeah. I Yeah, I there's a lot of very good, not very good, but I feel like there's a lot of plot holes in like evolution as conceived by Darwin. I'm not saying that, there's no evolution. I'm just saying the mechanisms by which it occurs and the way in which he prescribes that it occurs, it seems like there's still more to be explored, and that the story's not, completely over yet. But so going back then to religion, um as you said, you don't think it's a uh would it be fair to say that you think there's a biological imperative of some kind, but that it didn't necessarily we don't necessarily have it here today because it was evolutionarily advantageous? Would that be like a fair assessment of what you think?
Absolutely, yeah. You could call it like an evolutionary accident or something like that.
Okay.
And it is an accident because think about how many people have died because of religion.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
It's like a
What
big accident.
Yeah. So, from that perspective, again, like evolutionarily, how do you think religion fits into the story of human beings?
Evolutionarily speaking.
Uh, I guess just up against the light that it's like, yeah, we did evolve, like there was evolution, like we are obviously very social creatures, and as you're saying, like there's certainly something to be said about like, well, it does serve a social function, but at the same time, we can't just reduce it only to that. So, what would you say is the other stuff that fills in the gaps there?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I think I would say that this scientific perspective of religion as being something that evolved into us, but accidentally, and as not having a function. I don't think that so that scientific perspective could make one think that because it evolved and emerged, that it's not true.
Hmm.
One might think, you know, clearly religion is not a feature of the planet, of nature. It was something that evolved into an organism that then turned around and imposed that idea onto the world, onto nature. And I think that that can simultaneously be true, but also religion itself be true. Does that make
Hmm.
sense? So it's
Okay.
like just because it's emergent doesn't mean it's not capital T true. So
Hmm.
this doesn't mean I believe in all religions, right? I don't. I don't
Hmm.
even, I'm not even fully sure if I believe in one of them. But I think that truth is verging on relative. And so to say that, just because it emerged suddenly in evolution somewhere, doesn't mean that it is like false, imaginary, fleeting. All things are false, imaginary, and fleeting, right? They're all impermanent, right? They're all illusory. So I think that because of that, religion, it doesn't lose any sort of personal importance because of it emerging in this way for those who believe that, it's important and that it emerged. And I also don't think that um, this idea of truth, capital T truth, should have so much power over religion and over how we conceive of what is true, how we conceive of that which is valuable to us and what isn't.
Yeah.
Like, I think that religion can be not true but be valuable at the same time. Or I think
Hmm.
that it can be true and valuable but not real. Or
Yeah.
I think that you can believe it and it can be valuable, but it's not true or it's not real. And it's okay. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
Yeah,
for
for sure.
example, like one of my favorite quotes I've heard from I don't even remember now who, but it was have your beliefs but don't believe them.
Mm.
And it's speaking to a spirit of being critical of your beliefs and recognizing their limitations and reevaluating them, but also having them and understanding and keeping close to your heart. Like, yes, I love this idea I have about something, but I recognize that the real world functions in X, Y, or Z fashion, and it may or may not be applicable.
For sure. Yeah, going off of that, and then I think we can wrap up here. Um, I forget who it was exactly, but I believe it was in Dr. Callahan's class, but someone had proposed that a good way to think about religion from a religious studies perspective anyway, is to think about it like fiction.
Hmm.
So, if you're watching Superman in the movie theater, hopefully you're not sitting there going, he can't fly, he can't shoot lasers out of his eyes, that's impossible. You know, you probably get kicked out and
Yeah.
you'd be really not fun to watch movies with. But more importantly, you can still get something very meaningful from that movie, even though that didn't actually happen. Now, I'm not here to say what did and didn't happen in religion. And same as you, I believe that, well, I don't know to the extent that you believe it's possible, but I think that some things that happen that people say happen to religion happen. There's others that I'm like, no, that didn't happen. I'm very certain that didn't happen. I'm 100% certain that didn't happen. But I can still get something useful from it for myself regardless. So, do you know who that was?
Um,
Looking at it like fiction.
I don't remember. It might have been Professor Callahan himself.
Okay, gotcha. And then just since I'm thinking of that, I ran that by a friend of mine, and he's very religious, and I'm not sure if I had offended him or not, but regardless, he gave me something very important to walk away with, and he's like, "Huh, well, what if you just thought about it as stories? Like religion has various stories and different stories about this and how this happens, when, why this." I'm like, "Huh, that's that's a way better way to look at it. I like that actually." So now I say, that's how I try to interpret it as stories that, and well, you did a better job of articulating that.
I
Uh,
really like the idea of looking at it as fiction, though. I mean, I can understand how saying that it's fiction to somebody might make them think, oh, you're telling me that we're lying to everybody. You're telling me that we're spreading falsehoods. We're saying things happened when they really didn't.
mm,
Fiction does have that connotation sometimes, but we all spend way more time with fiction than we do with anything else. We spend time with movies and books and television shows, and we are the most emotionally invested in those fictions, in those stories, you know,
Mm,
and especially in this current time period, it's kind of, I mean, you could almost say that if there is any such thing as a universal human religion, it is fiction, right?
mm,
It's performance, it's making up stories, it's imagining and coming up with stuff that didn't happen or can't
yeah,
happen or won't happen. And just because it can't, didn't, won't, doesn't mean that it's any less valuable, any less significant, any less important. And it doesn't make somebody sort of less than for believing it
yeah.
or investing in it.
Great point. If Naruto was a religion, I would definitely be an adherent follower. So,
Well, there's even like Jedi religion out in, especially I think
oh,
in Australia, it's like a nationally recognized religious group, you know,
really? That's
believing in the Force and everything. Yeah. I mean, and again, it came from a fiction, it came from a movie. So
yeah. Hey, you know, whatever works.
exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was fun. But I think it's about time to wrap up. Nick, did you have anything else that you'd like to end with for any of the terms or anything that we talked about?
Nope. That takes care of it for me.
Awesome. All right, man. Well, it was great having you. Thanks for helping me out with those terms. I feel like I use them a lot, so hopefully people can refer back to this if I'm not making sense and they want to make a little bit more sense out of it. Um, okay. Well, we'll end here for today. Nick, it was great having you. I'll see you again next time.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It was a wonderful time. And thanks to everybody who's listening.
All right. Bye, guys. Take care.